Gather round the fire, friends. Tonight we're diving into the depths of the most chilling, unsolved serial killer cases that'll have you double-checking those locks before bed. These aren't your run-of-the-mill killers. These are the ones who have evaded justice time and again, slipping through the cracks of the system like ghosts in the night, vanishing without a trace. The Babysitter Killer. Speaking of ghosts, let's start with the Babysitter Killer, a real-life boogeyman straight out of Oakland County, Michigan. Back in the mid-70s, this sick twist murdered at least 4 kids, holding them captive in his lair of horrors for days, even weeks, before coldly ending their young lives. Can you imagine the sheer terror those families endured? The sleepless nights, the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing if their child was still alive? The police had a few promising leads, like a suspicious vehicle that might have belonged to the killer, but this monster was slippery as an eel, leaving nothing but a trail of cold cases and a DNA profile that didn't match a single soul in their databases. The Alphabet Killer. Now let's move on to a killer with a twisted sense of humor that'll make your stomach churn. The Alphabet Killer. This guy was operating in Rochester, New York in the early 70s. He only targeted young girls whose first and last names started with the same letter. Twisted, right? Witnesses caught glimpses of the killer's handiwork, like the poor soul Carmen Colon, seen half naked on the side of the road, desperately trying to flee her captor. But despite their efforts, the monster always stayed one step ahead, leaving only a trail of broken lives and unanswered questions in his wake. The cops had a few suspects over the years, but nothing solid enough to slap the cuffs on this merciless butcher. The West Mesa Bone Collector. The West Mesa Bone Collector, a name that sounds straight out of a nightmare, might still be active in Albuquerque, New Mexico this very moment. Or hell, he could be anywhere, which is perhaps the most terrifying thought of all. In 2009, police happened upon a grisly, gut-wrenching scene while investigating a tip. 11 bodies, the bones of 11 innocent souls, buried in a mass grave in the West Mesa area. All of them linked to missing persons cases involving women last seen between 2003 and 2006. As the investigation deepened, an even darker theory emerged. Some suggested this killer, or killers, could be part of an organized trafficking ring, preying on the most vulnerable women in a sickening circle of abuse, violence, and death. Despite a massive $100,000 reward for any information leading to an arrest and a steady trickle of tips, the case remains as cold as the graves those poor souls were discarded in. The Servant Girl Annihilator. Let's take a haunting trip through the archives, back to the gaslit streets of 1880s Austin, Texas, where fear gripped the city under the shadow of a killer known as the Servant Girl Annihilator, or the Austin Axe Murderer. This maniac specifically targeted domestic workers, watching from the shadows before violently dragging the terrified young women from their beds in the dead of night and brutally slaughtering them with the massive swing of an axe. On Christmas Eve, 1885, he even managed to butcher a horrific trifecta of victims in one night, leaving the city trembling on what should have been a joyous holiday. The prime suspect was a man named Nathan Elgin, whose tracks at several crime scenes were distinct. He had just 4 toes on one foot, but before the full weight of justice could be delivered, Elgin was gunned down in the street by a police officer. Was he responsible for the other deaths? We will never know. The Black Doodler. Now, let's head back to the seedy, neon-lit underbelly of the 1970s San Francisco, where a killer with a cold, sinister, artistic streak was leaving his grotesque masterpieces across the city. The Black Doodler, as the media deemed him, would frequent gay clubs and bars, luring unsuspecting men from the community with the promise of sketching their likeness and capturing their beauty on paper. But instead of pencil strokes, he captured them in a far darker way, with a knife plunged into their bodies, assaulting and stabbing them, leaving a trail of tortured bodies behind as his own twisted exhibition. Estimates range from 6 to a staggering 14 victims, but with the social stigma and persecution surrounding the gay community back then, many survivors were simply too afraid to come forward and work with the police, allowing the Black Doodler to fade back into the night. However, just a few years ago, the tides seemed to shift, the case heating up again with new evidence and a $200,000 reward for any information leading to the killer's capture. The cops say they've narrowed it down to one strong person of interest in their sights, a man who still walks free on those same San Francisco streets to this day. The Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer, a case so infamous and so utterly chilling. This twisted mind game that gripped Northern California lasted for over a terrifying year in the late 1960s, as the self-anointed Zodiac taunted police and the press, leaving a trail of cryptic messages and clues in his wake. He'd leave bullets or other DNA evidence at the grisly crime scenes, threatened to indiscriminately shoot up buses filled with innocent children. He even mailed victims' bloody clothing to newspapers as his calling card. For months, the Zodiac held the entire region hostage with his sickening, meticulous codes and ciphers, only 2 of which have been definitely solved to this day, leaving the rest of his twisted delusions still lingering in the shadows. 5 murders are definitely linked to the Zodiac, but the madman himself scrawled in his letters that he had in fact claimed a terrifying 37 lives in total. Over the decades, a handful of suspects from all walks of life have arisen, but none conclusive enough to put the beast away for good. Jack the Ripper. And last, but certainly not least, we have the granddaddy of all unsolved serial killer cases, one that has been dissected and debated for over a century, the blood-stained legend of Jack the Ripper. This shocking case cast its demonic shadow over the streets of London's East End all the way back in 1888, as a sadistic, nameless killer brutally butchered at least 5 women, mutilating them in the most unimaginable ways. But the monster's evil didn't stop with just the killings. No, he took the game of terror even further by penning horrific letters to authorities, taunting them about his handiwork. Despite a massive manhunt and hundreds of potential suspects questioned, from lowly butchers to even members of the royal family, Jack was never apprehended. The investigation went bitterly cold, with most of the physical evidence and records from that period tragically destroyed forever in the bombs of World War II. To this day, Jack the Ripper's true identity remains one of the greatest unpunished mysteries the world has ever known, an enigma that has consumed authors, filmmakers, and countless amateur sleuths over the decades, all proposing their own theories while we're still left wondering who was the evil lurking behind that blood-stained cloak. Well, there you have it, friends. A bone-chilling tour through some of the darkest, most unspeakable cases that continue to linger in the shadows even decades or centuries later. While these cases may have gone cold, you can bet your life that the clues and evidence are still out there somewhere, just waiting to be uncovered by someone bold and brilliant enough to connect the dots.